Have you ever found yourself rooting for a character that wasn't exactly the hero? In today's stories, morally gray characters are stealing the spotlight, and it doesn't matter if they're the protagonist or the antagonist. Let's explore why we're all rooting for characters that walk the line between right and wrong, and also why we need them in literature. If you're not familiar with the term morally gray, a morally gray character is a character that walks the line between good and evil. Now, I personally have always been drawn to these type of characters. My sister actually likes to make fun of me mercilessly for always liking the worst characters. And I don't seem to be the only one, with songs like this coming out.
Well, I can't shake this feeling, 'cause I think I'm falling for the villain.
So let's dive into why we're drawn to these characters. In order to have a morally gray character, you have to understand the difference between heroes and villains. Traditional heroes often exemplify virtues like bravery, honesty, selflessness, and justice. They operate with a clear moral framework. They strive for their noble principles while adhering to a strict moral code. Some popular characters from literature that embody this archetype are Frodo from Lord of the Rings and Atticus from To Kill a Mockingbird. Their journeys will usually involve a clear battle between good and evil, and they offer an optimistic view of morality and justice. In contrast, classic villains are identified by their malevolent goals. They're often driven by greed, revenge, or the pursuit of power, and they serve as obstacles to the hero's journey. Notable examples of this, of course, are Sauron from Lord of the Rings or the White Witch from the Chronicles of Narnia. These villain character arcs are often very straightforward, and they reinforce the dichotomy of good versus evil. So now that we understand the difference between heroes and villains, let's talk about the different types of morally gray characters, because yes, there are different types. First, you have your morally gray protagonists, also known as the anti-heroes. And an anti-hero is the central character in a story that lacks the typical character traits of a hero. Traits such as courage, morality, or idealism. But this character still fills the role of protagonist. And these characters often operate in kind of morally gray areas where they are driven by personal desires, flawed traits, or unconventional methods rather than heroism. Kelsier from the Mistborn series is an excellent example of this. While his ultimate goal is to free his people from oppression, he uses violence and manipulation to get there. And I think one of the reasons that we like these types of characters is because it feels a little bit more realistic. They reflect real-world complexities, which makes them more relatable and unpredictable. Then you have the morally gray antagonists, or what I call anti-villains. An anti-villain is a character who fulfills the role of villain, but possesses more heroic traits or motivations that are typically associated with heroes or good characters. Unlike traditional villains whose motivations are driven by malice, greed, or the pursuit of power, anti-villains often have noble or sympathetic goals. They just use questionable methods to get there. So how did we get from black and white morality in classic literature to these morally gray archetypes that you see in literature today? In classic literature, characters often followed a very strict dichotomy. Heroes represented virtues, while villains represented evil. And this black and white morality is rooted in ancient epics and classic texts, in things like the Iliad or the Divine Comedy. These works present their characters either as characters of complete virtue or agents of destruction. For example, heroes like Beowulf. They are noble, self-sacrificing, and dedicated to vanquishing evil forces. Or characters like Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost. While this character is more complex, Satan in this story still serves as a foil to goodness, and he embodies rebellion in opposition to divine order. And the moral simplicity of these stories was meant to teach the readers lessons on virtue, justice, and the consequences of moral failing. things. But something started to change in the 19th century, and authors began to challenge these rigid moralities. Authors like Alexander Dumas and Mary Shelley, who wanted to explore the psychological and social forces that shape human behavior. So let's look at the Count of Monte Cristo. Edmond Dantes is initially a character that is seen as wronged, and who is just seeking justice after being falsely imprisoned. However, as he takes on the persona of the Count of Monte Cristo, his quest for vengeance becomes more morally complicated. His actions, which can be ruthless and manipulative, often blur the lines between justice and revenge. And it raised questions about whether his moral decay was justified based on his treatment. And you come across a similar moral quandary in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The monster is often seen as the villain because of the destruction that he causes, but his actions are driven by rejection and isolation. As an outcast, he seeks acceptance and understanding, but his creator, Victor Frankenstein, abandons him, which leads him towards violent acts of vengeance. And the story asks readers to consider how much of his villainy is a product of his consequences or his natural behavior. So what these works of this time did is they raised an increased interest in psychology, and they emphasized moral ambiguities as a reflection of human existence. And modern narratives have embraced morally gray characters because they reflect the complexities of contemporary society. And these characters often defy simple categorization, but here are just a few other examples. The first example I can really think of this that comes to mind from modern literature, and by modern I'm saying like within the last 10 years, is Kaz Brekker from the Six of Crows series. Kaz makes really questionable decisions, but his motivations remain compelling and understandable. In a lower stakes narrative, you are now starting to see protagonists that are allowed to be flawed, such as Noemi from Mexican Gothic, who, while she is a good person, she's quite shallow at the beginning of the book. You've been seeing more sympathetic villains in modern literature. Antagonists whose motives or actions, while often harmful or destructive, stem from an understandable or relatable reason. A perfect book to exemplify this type of character arc is Vicious by V.E. Schwab. Victor Vale and Eli Ever are constantly blurring the lines between hero and villain as they pursue their personal vendettas. And I would even put Thanos in Avengers Infinity Wars into this category as well, because his motivations are rooted in a desire for balance, even though his methods are extreme. Another type of morally gray character, or a character that kind of doesn't necessarily blur the line between good and evil, but I still want to include them in this categorization, are your complex antagonists. And these characters, unlike your sympathetic villains, their motivations aren't really sympathetic, but their characters are so well developed that their motivations are very clear. They also often have a lot of internal conflict and have very layered personalities. So some characters I can think of in this instance would be like Tywin Lannister in A Game of Thrones, where his really ruthless political maneuvers and his cold pragmatism are all in the pursuit of securing his family's legacy. Another example I can think of is actually a character from what prompted me to start this YouTube channel, the Darkling from Shadow and Bone. While he is portrayed as a bit more of a sympathetic villain in the TV show, at least in the first season, the books definitely portray him as a more complex antagonist. His desire to reshape the world may seem noble at first, but his manipulative nature and thirst for power overshadow his motivations in the long run. So why are we seeing more and more characters like this in modern literature and media? And I think it largely has to do with certain cultural and societal influences. Influences such as postmodernism, which rejects absolute moral truths in favor of nuanced perspectives. You also have existentialism, which focuses on individual moral agency. And you see these in characters that are constantly trying to come into grips with their choices. And then, of course, it's perpetuated by modern media, which challenges audiences to empathize with morally complex characters, which you can see most notably in shows like Breaking Bad or or a Game of Thrones. This evolution reflects our increasingly nuanced view of human nature. From rigid moral dichotomies to morally ambiguous figures, literature reflects the complexities of human nature. These characters prompt readers to confront ethical dilemmas, question societal norms, and explore the multifaceted nature of morality in today's society. So that's the kind of intellectual argument for why we have seen more and more morally gray characters in literature. But let's talk about it from more of an entertainment perspective. I would say that from an entertainment perspective, morally gray characters have three major traits that kind of draw people to them. And the first is relatability. Readers connect with flawed characters that reflect their own struggles. And I think this is one of the reasons, while it was not a book I particularly enjoyed reading, I know a lot of people who loved reading The Catcher in the Rye because Holden Caulfield kind of embodied teenage resistance. And that's an experience that a lot of people can identify with as they try and find their own place in the world. The second point is that a lot of morally gray characters have really good narrative depth. They create richer and more layered stories. Kaz Brekker is a character that is both a criminal mastermind and a deeply scarred individual. And that is a compelling narrative. And the last one is unpredictability. Their morally ambiguous nature keeps audiences guessing, because if you're not limited to what is right and what is wrong, a character could make any choice in a given situation. And Victor Vale in Vicious is an excellent example of this, because while he is driven by a very strong sense of justice, he has no qualms about using violence to get there. While I do enjoy morally gray characters, I am gonna give you a few arguments for why we should still also see some of these more black and white good versus evil narratives. When there are clear heroes and villains, I would say this is particularly good for younger audiences. It helps them to understand moral lessons without the ambiguity. Stories featuring strong, clear heroes and villains allow a child to grasp concepts of good versus evil, and these help children develop a sense of right and wrong early on in their life. Additionally, this more straightforward moral divide is often more comforting and reassuring. Another argument for more black and white characters is that clear heroes are aspirational. Characters like Captain America and Katniss Everdeen embody the ideals of standing up for what's right, even when faced with personal sacrifice. Additionally, characters like Percy Jackson and Superman provide hope, illustrating that idealism and perseverance can make real and meaningful changes in the world. These heroes serve as very valuable role models, helping readers to develop a sense of personal responsibility, as well as the confidence to face adversity. I also think that clear heroes and villains offer comfort and accessibility. They provide a sense of certainty in the narrative. They allow readers to escape the moral ambiguities of real life and to dive into a world where good ultimately triumphs. And that can be very emotionally fulfilling. For example, characters like Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings or Alice in Alice in Wonderland provide clear moral guidance, with heroes who act in pursuit of justice and villains who embody evil. These stories focus on excitement and action, allowing the reader to focus on the journey and the emotional highs without the moral complexities that you see in the real world. As I mentioned before going into this section, I agree with all of these points. I think we need to have morally gray characters and we need to keep good versus bad stories around. But I think the rise in popularity of morally gray characters is that while clear heroes and villains provide simplicity and moral clarity, morally gray characters offer an opportunity to explore the complexities of human nature and decision-making, and more accurately reflects the real-world decisions we have to make every day. And more importantly, these characters challenge readers to think critically. They also offer more meaningful explorations into identity, decision-making, and personal growth. And I truly think these stories ultimately help readers build empathy through the understanding that the world, in all of its complexities, is very rarely black or white. Let's see what stories tomorrow brings.
you.